Imagine walking through a busy American city today. There are cars moving through intersections, traffic lights cycling through their colors, people on sidewalks, and buildings rising on either side. Everything looks exactly as it should. The city feels solid, established, permanent. It is easy to assume that what you see is what has always been there, that the ground beneath the pavement is simply the natural earth, and that the streets were always at this level. But that assumption, in several American cities, turns out to be incorrect. What if the ground beneath your feet was not always at this level? It is an unusual question, and at first it might not seem worth asking. Surely the ground is the ground. Surely streets were built where the land already was. But in a number of documented cases across the United States, the ground level of entire cities was deliberately changed, raised by several feet, and in some cases, by more than a full story. The surface you walk on today is not the original surface. It is a newer layer, constructed above an older one. This raises an immediate question. If the ground was raised, what happened to everything that was already there? The buildings, the sidewalks, the storefronts, the street-level infrastructure. Where did it all go? The answer, in these cities, is that it went downward. It did not disappear. It did not collapse. In many cases, it simply became underground. The original ground floor of a building became a basement. The sidewalk that pedestrians once used became a subterranean corridor. The street that carriages traveled on became a dark passage beneath the newer road above. In places like Seattle, Washington, and Chicago, Illinois, this is not a disputed claim. It is a documented historical reality. You can visit parts of these buried cities today. Guided tours take visitors beneath the current street level and walk them through passages that were once open to the sky. You can see original brickwork, old storefront frames, the remnants of wooden sidewalks, and the structural bones of buildings that still stand above, but whose foundations now sit in a space that most people never think about. The buried city is real. It is down there. But the fact that something exists does not automatically explain why it exists. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. The official explanations for why these cities were buried have been told many times. They appear in local history books, in museum exhibits, in the narration of those underground tours. The explanations are coherent. They reference real historical events, fires, floods, engineering decisions, and for most people, they are satisfying enough. The tour ends, visitors return to the surface, and the buried city is filed away as an interesting curiosity from the past. However, when the details of these explanations are examined more carefully, certain parts begin to feel incomplete. Not wrong, necessarily, but not entirely sufficient either. There are gaps in the timeline. There are logistical questions that the official accounts do not fully address. There are features of the buried structures that do not match exactly what the explanations would predict. These are not dramatic contradictions. They are quieter than that. They are the kind of details that only become visible when you slow down and ask a second question after the first one has been answered. Take the basic premise itself. Buildings that once had ground floor entrances now have those same doors sitting below the current surface. Think about what that means physically. A door that was at street level, a door that a customer would have walked through without stepping up or down, is now accessible only by going underground. The threshold has not moved. The building has not moved. What changed is the ground outside it. The street was raised to a higher level, and the original entrance was left behind, now opening into a space that no longer connects to the outside world in the way it once did. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Raising a street level is not a simple task. It requires enormous quantities of fill material, dirt, gravel, rubble, or some combination of these, to be brought in and deposited across an entire city district. It requires the construction of new road surfaces, new sidewalks, new connections between buildings, and the new ground level. It requires that every building either adapt its entrances to the new height or accept that its original ground floor has effectively become a basement. In a city of any significant size, this is a massive undertaking. And the question of how it was accomplished, particularly in the 1800s, before modern heavy machinery, is one that the official histories tend to address only in general terms. Sidewalks that people used to walk on are now underground passages. This is perhaps the most striking image connected to the buried city phenomenon. A sidewalk is a functional object. It is built for people to use, to walk on, to stand on, to move through the city. It is not built to be sealed underground. Yet in Seattle's underground, there are sections of original sidewalk that have been preserved almost exactly as they were when they were in use. The wood is old. The surface is worn. But the structure is intact. It was not destroyed. It was not cleared away. It was simply built over and left. Why would a sidewalk be left in place rather than removed? The practical answer is that it was easier to build above it than to tear it out. But that answer leads to another question. If entire city blocks were being raised and new infrastructure was being installed at the new level, why did so much of the original infrastructure survive intact rather than being demolished or repurposed? In some cases, the underground spaces were used briefly as service passages before being sealed off entirely. In other cases, they appear to have simply been closed and forgotten. The reasoning behind each decision is not always documented. The question of why anyone would bury an entire city sounds dramatic when phrased that way. But framed differently, it is actually a practical engineering question. When a city needs to raise its street level for drainage, for flood control, for sanitation, the most efficient approach is often to build upward rather than to tear everything down and start again. The original structures become the foundation for the new layer. The old ground becomes the ceiling of a new underground space. This process is logical. It is economical. It has happened in various forms in cities around the world, not just in the United States. And yet the official explanation, as it is usually presented, does not always account for every observable detail. This is where the curiosity begins, not in a claim that something dishonest has occurred, but in the simpler observation that some of the details do not fully align with the story as it has been handed down. The timeline in some cities seems compressed. The scale of the work seems large relative to the resources available at the time. The condition of the buried structure seems, in certain areas, better than the circumstances of their burial would predict. The official explanation exists. This is important to acknowledge. It has been accepted for a long time, for over a century in some cases. Historians, engineers, and city officials have documented these raising projects in considerable detail. Records exist. Plans were drawn. Photographs were taken. The events are not imagined. But there is a difference between an explanation being accepted and an explanation being complete. History is often recorded in summary form, with the major events noted and the finer logistics left unaddressed. What gets written down is usually what someone decided was important enough to preserve. What gets left out is often what seemed obvious at the time, or what no one thought to question. When you look closely at the buried cities of America, certain parts of the accepted explanation start to feel incomplete in exactly that way. Not fabricated, not conspiratorial, simply not fully resolved. The gaps are there. They are not large gaps, necessarily, but they are present. And in history, as in most things, the gaps are often where the most interesting questions live. The visible city above the surface has been explained, cataloged, and moved on from. It is the city below the surface, still intact, still sitting there, still mostly unexamined, that continues to raise questions that have not been fully answered. And that is where the curiosity begins. Not at the surface, where everything looks normal, but one level down, where the original city waits in the dark, and where the full story of how it came to be there has never quite been told completely. Very buried city has an explanation. That is the first thing to understand. No one is pretending that the underground spaces do not exist, or that the ground level was never changed. The historical record acknowledges all of this. What the historical record provides, in each case, is a reason, a documented cause that is presented as sufficient to explain what happened. And in most cases, that reason involves some combination of natural disaster, poor infrastructure, and practical engineering decisions made under pressure. The explanations are not identical from city to city, but they follow a recognizable pattern. And understanding that pattern is important before asking whether any part of it is incomplete. In Seattle, Washington, the official explanation begins with geography. The city was established in the mid-1800s on land that sat very close to sea level. Parts of it were built on tide flats, low-lying coastal ground that was subject to flooding with the movement of the tides. This was not an unusual situation for early American port cities. Access to water was essential for trade and transport, and so settlements were often placed as close to the waterline as possible. The trade-off was instability. Low ground near tidal water is difficult to build on, difficult to drain, and difficult to keep clean. Seattle's founders accepted those difficulties in exchange for proximity to the port. The problems that came with that location were serious and well documented. When the tide rose, it did not simply wet the shoreline. It pushed back through the drainage and sewage systems that had been built under the streets. The pipes that were supposed to carry waste away from the city would instead fill with seawater and reverse their flow. Waste would back up into the streets. Mud would accumulate. The lower sections of the city were regularly rendered impassable and unsanitary. This was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a recurring condition that the city's residents and officials had struggled with for years before any significant solution was found. The fire of 1889 is presented as the event that finally forced a solution. On June 6th of that year, a fire started in a cabinet shop near the waterfront and spread rapidly through the downtown district. The buildings at that time were largely constructed from wood, and the fire moved quickly. By the time it was controlled, a significant portion of Seattle's central business district had been destroyed. Dozens of city blocks were reduced to ash and rubble. The damage was extensive, but the official history frames this disaster as an opportunity. With so much of the city already gone, planners argued that this was the moment to rebuild correctly, to address the flooding and sewage problems that had plagued the original city by constructing the new streets at a higher elevation. The plan, as it has been described, involved raising the street level by roughly 1 to 3 stories above the original grade. Engineers would build up the land using fill material, construct new roads and sidewalks at the new height, and require that any new buildings connect to this elevated surface. The old ground level, what remained of the original city after the fire, would simply be left below. In some sections, the underground spaces created by this process were used temporarily as service passages. Businesses that were rebuilding at the new street level used the old passages for storage and access. Eventually, as the new city took shape above, those passages were sealed off and largely forgotten. This explanation is coherent. It describes a real fire, a real geographic problem, and a real engineering decision. And it is supported by contemporaneous records, newspaper accounts from 1889, photographs from the rebuilding period, city planning documents, and the physical evidence of the underground passages themselves. The explanation has been repeated so many times, in so many sources, that it has acquired the weight of settled fact. Visitors to Seattle's underground today hear this story on guided tours, and it makes sense. The fire happened. The city was rebuilt. The streets were raised. The old city went underground. But this is where it becomes unclear. If the street level was raised specifically to solve the flooding and sewage problems caused by the tidal conditions, then the raised streets should have eliminated those problems. And yet, several historical accounts indicate that flooding continued to affect parts of Seattle even after the rebuilding. The sewage issues were not immediately resolved by the raising of the streets. Infrastructure improvements helped over time, but the raising of the ground level alone was not the complete solution that it is sometimes described as being. This detail does not disprove the official explanation, but it does suggest that the relationship between the raising and the problem it was supposed to solve was more complicated than the simplified version implies. Chicago presents a different version of the same general story. Here, the raising did not follow a single catastrophic fire. Instead, it was a deliberate engineering project carried out over a period of years in the mid-1800s, before the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. The city had been built on low, swampy ground near Lake Michigan, and like Seattle, it suffered from chronic drainage and sewage problems. The solution proposed by engineers was to raise the grade of the entire city, not by filling in the land beneath the streets, but by physically lifting existing buildings using an extraordinary system of hydraulic jacks. The Chicago raising is well documented and genuinely remarkable. Engineers would slide large numbers of jack screws beneath the foundations of brick buildings, sometimes hundreds of jacks beneath a single large structure, and raised the building incrementally, a small amount at a time, over a period of days or weeks. The buildings were occupied during this process in some cases. Business continued. Guests stayed in hotels. Customers visited shops. The buildings rose slowly, and the street level was eventually brought up to meet them. This project is cited in engineering histories as one of the most ambitious urban infrastructure operations of the 19th century. And yet, even here, the explanation carries details that are not fully addressed in most accounts. The scale of the Chicago raising was immense. The number of buildings involved, the coordination required, the volume of fill material needed to bring the streets up to the new level. All of this represented a logistical challenge that would have been significant even with modern equipment. In the 1850s and 1860s, the tools available were far more limited. The question of how the project was managed, how the labor was organized, and how the fill material was sourced and transported has not been fully answered in the historical record. The outcome is well documented. The process, in its finer details, is less so. These are the explanations that appear in textbooks, in city histories, and in the narration given on guided underground tours. They are presented as settled history, as events that happened, were recorded, and are now understood. And in broad terms, they are. The fires were real. The engineering projects were real. The underground spaces are real. None of that is in dispute. But settled history and complete history are not always the same thing. A historical account can be accurate in its major points while leaving significant details unresolved. It can describe what happened without fully explaining how, or why in precisely that way, or what else may have been occurring alongside the events that made it into the record. When the details of these explanations are examined carefully, certain things do not entirely add up, not in a way that overturns the basic account, but in a way that creates questions at the edges of it. The timing of some events is compressed in ways that are difficult to explain given the technology of the era. The condition of certain underground structures suggests they were built with care and intention, not simply left behind in the chaos of emergency rebuilding. The gaps in the archival record, the periods where documentation is thin or missing, do not always correspond to the periods of most intense activity, as one might expect. Sometimes the silence in the record falls precisely where the most important decisions would have been made. It is also worth noting that the explanations, as they are typically presented, focus almost entirely on practical necessity. The cities were raised because they had to be raised, because the water table was too high, because the fire destroyed what was there, because the drainage systems failed. Necessity drove the decision. But necessity alone does not explain execution. It explains why something was done. It does not fully explain how it was done at the scale and speed that the historical record implies. And it does not explain why, in certain areas, the original underground infrastructure was preserved with such apparent care when it could just as easily have been demolished. Some researchers who have studied these underground spaces have noted that the quality of construction in certain sections is higher than what emergency post-fire rebuilding would typically produce. Brickwork that appears precise, structural elements that appear designed for longevity, spaces that were clearly intended to function, not simply to be sealed off. This observation does not fit cleanly into the official narrative of hasty reconstruction following disaster. It is the kind of detail that the standard explanation glosses over, not because anyone is trying to conceal it, but because it was never considered important enough to explain. And things that are never considered important enough to explain have a way of remaining unexplained. The explanations exist. They are real. They are accepted. But acceptance is not the same as completeness. Somewhere between the official account and the physical evidence that still sits underground, there are questions that have not been asked loudly enough to require an answer. The underground passages of Seattle and the raised blocks of Chicago are presented as closed chapters. Things that happened, were understood, and were moved on from. But some of the details that were moved on from are still there, waiting in the dark beneath the streets, as unresolved as they were the day the surface was sealed above them. The first serious problem with the official explanation is not a historical one. It is a practical one. And practical problems are often more difficult to dismiss than historical disagreements, because they do not depend on interpretation. They depend on numbers, on physics, on the basic realities of how much work human beings and their tools can accomplish within a given period of time. When you examine the timeline of what is supposed to have happened in cities like Seattle, when you look at the scale of what was done, and then look at the resources that were available to do it, something does not quite fit. The timeline feels compressed. The pace feels faster than what the circumstances would reasonably allow. And that feeling, when examined carefully, does not go away. Raising an entire city is not a figure of speech. It is a literal description of an enormous physical undertaking. To raise the street level of a city district by 1, 2, or 3 stories means that every inch of ground in that area must be elevated. Fill material must be brought in, vast quantities of it, and deposited, spread, compacted, and built upon. New drainage systems must be installed within that fill. New road surfaces must be laid on top. New sidewalks must be constructed. Every building that wishes to remain accessible at the new level must have its entrance modified, its steps rebuilt, its connections to the street reimagined. And all of this must be coordinated across an entire city district, not just a single block or a single street. The engineering challenges involved are genuinely enormous. This is not an exaggeration. Modern civil engineering projects of comparable scale, raising a road through a flood zone, regrading a city district, replacing underground infrastructure across a large urban area, take years to complete with the benefit of heavy machinery, computerized planning systems, large professional workforces, and substantial public funding. They require detailed surveys, environmental assessments, structural analyses, and coordinated logistics that involve dozens of contractors and suppliers. Even with all of that, such projects routinely run over schedule and over budget. They are considered major achievements when completed on time. In the late 1800s, none of those advantages existed. The machinery available was limited to steam-powered equipment and hand tools. Surveying was done by trained individuals with manual instruments. Communication was carried out by messenger, by telegraph, or in person. The labor force was made up of workers who had no access to modern safety equipment, no standardized training, and no centralized project management systems. Funding came from a combination of private investment, local government, and individual property owners, sources that were often unreliable, slow to disperse, and subject to political and economic pressures. This was the toolkit available to the people who, according to the official account, raised entire city districts within just a few years. Seattle's rebuilding after the 1889 fire is the clearest example of a timeline that seems difficult to reconcile with the available resources. The fire occurred in June of 1889. By most accounts, the rebuilding of the city, at the new, elevated street level, was substantially complete within 2 to 3 years. Some sources suggest that key sections of the new downtown were functional within 18 months of the fire. That is an extraordinarily short period for a project of this scale. Within less than 2 years, an entirely new street grid had been established above the ruins of the old one. New buildings had been constructed at the new level. The old ground had been sealed beneath the new streets, and the city was, by most descriptions, operating normally again. At first, this pace might seem like a testament to the determination and energy of Seattle's residents. Cities do rebuild after disasters. History offers many examples of rapid reconstruction following fires, floods, and other catastrophes. Human communities have a strong instinct to restore what has been lost, and they can move with surprising speed when motivated by necessity. So it would be easy to accept the Seattle timeline simply as evidence of that instinct at work. People were driven, resources were pooled, work proceeded around the clock, and the city was rebuilt. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the rebuilding of Seattle after 1889 was not simply reconstruction. It was reconstruction at a different level. Every building that went up did so on new ground that had to be created. Fill material had to be placed, compacted, and stabilized before any structure could safely stand on it. The new street infrastructure had to be designed and built from scratch. The old underground had to be managed, accessed, used temporarily, and eventually sealed. This was not just replacing what burned. It was replacing it at a fundamentally different elevation, which added an entire layer of engineering complexity to every single step of the process. And all of that, according to the official timeline, happened in roughly the same time it takes today to complete a single highway interchange. The question of where the fill material came from is one that the official explanations address only vaguely. Thousands, almost certainly tens of thousands, of tons of soil, gravel, and rubble would have been required to raise the street level across multiple city blocks by the stated amount. Material of this kind does not simply appear. It must be excavated from somewhere, transported to the site, and deposited in a controlled way. In Seattle's case, some historical accounts reference material from nearby hillsides being sluiced down into the lower parts of the city. This process, known as hydraulic regrading, was used later in Seattle's history for other projects and is well documented. But for the 1889 rebuilding specifically, the records of how the fill was obtained and moved are not detailed. They exist in general terms. The specifics are thin. This pattern, of general accounts without specific logistics, appears in other cities as well. In Chicago, the raising projects of the 1850s and 1860s are described in terms of their outcomes and their most dramatic moments. The image of entire buildings being lifted by hundreds of jackscrews is vivid and memorable, and it appears frequently in historical accounts. But the full scope of the fill operation that accompanied those liftings, the material that had to be placed beneath the raised buildings, between them, under the streets, is discussed in far less detail. The fill had to come from somewhere. It had to be moved somehow. The records of that process, if they exist, are not prominently featured in the histories that most people encounter. It is worth pausing to consider what vague logistics actually mean in a historical context. When a historical account describes an outcome without describing the process, there are several possible explanations. One is that the process was straightforward enough that no one thought to document it carefully. It was simply work, and work was done. Another is that the records were kept but were later lost, damaged, or never transferred to archives, where they would be easily accessible. A third possibility is that the process was more improvised, more chaotic, and more uncertain than the clean narrative of the official account implies, and that the vagueness in the record reflects the vagueness of the process itself. None of these possibilities is more inherently likely than the others, but each one leads to a different understanding of what actually happened. The official explanations tend to focus on the outcome rather than the process. This is a common feature of historical narratives, and it is not in itself suspicious. History is written about results. It is written about decisions and their consequences, the day-to-day mechanics of how a project was executed, how many wagons were used, how many loads of fill were deposited per day, how the material was compacted and tested, are the kinds of details that rarely make it into the accounts that survive. They were recorded, if at all, in operational logs and contractor records that were not considered historically significant and were therefore not preserved. What we are left with is a narrative of what was achieved, with limited visibility into exactly how. And yet the how matters, because it is precisely in the how that the tension between the timeline and the available resources becomes most visible. We are told that it happened. We are given approximate dates. We are shown the result, the buried streets, the underground passages, the city that now sits above where the old city was. But the specific steps that connected the catastrophe of 1889 to the functional new city of 1891 or 1892 are not laid out in a way that can be fully verified against what we know about the capabilities of that era. The gap between what is claimed and what can be explained is not enormous, but it is present, and it is consistent, appearing not just in Seattle, but in multiple cities where similar projects are said to have occurred. Some historians have acknowledged this tension without fully resolving it. They note that the pace of rebuilding was remarkable, that the scale of the engineering was impressive, and that the resources of the era were stretched to accomplish what was done. These acknowledgments are honest, but they do not close the gap. Describing something as remarkable is not the same as explaining how it was possible. Acknowledging that resources were stretched is not the same as accounting for where all the necessary material and labor came from within the stated time frame. The admiration is understandable. The explanation still has openings in it. When details are vague in historical accounts, it does not necessarily mean something is wrong. Vagueness in old records is normal. Archives are incomplete. Documents are lost. Memories are imperfect. The people who did the work did not know they were making history. and they did not record their daily operations with the intention of satisfying the questions of future researchers. This is simply the condition of historical inquiry. It applies to almost every major event from the 19th century, and the buried cities of America are no exception to it. But gaps are worth noticing, not because every gap conceals something important, but because gaps mark the boundary of what is actually known versus what is assumed to be known. The official account of Seattle's rebuilding assumes that the logistics were manageable because the outcome was achieved. But the outcome being achieved does not, by itself, prove that the logistics were straightforward. It is possible to arrive at a correct answer without fully understanding the path that led there. And in the case of the buried cities, the path, the actual, day-by-day process of raising streets, moving fill, sealing the old ground, and constructing a new city on top of it all, remains only partially visible. What lies in the gaps between the known facts has not been recovered, and without it, the timeline remains one of the most quietly puzzling features of a story that already has more than a few unanswered questions. To properly understand why the timeline and logistics of these raising projects are puzzling, it helps to step back even further. The questions surrounding how these cities were raised only become fully visible when you understand what these cities already were before the raising happened. Because the picture that emerges when you look at Seattle and Chicago in their pre-raising years is not of rough, half-formed settlements still finding their footing. It is of cities that were already functioning, already developed, already integrated into regional and national economies. And that context changes the nature of the questions being asked. Seattle in the 1880s was, by most measures, a relatively young city. The settlement had been formally established only a few decades before the 1889 fire. In the grand timeline of American urban history, that is not a long time. And yet, by the time the fire occurred, Seattle was not a collection of temporary buildings arranged around a trading post. It had a real street grid, a mapped, organized layout of roads that divided the land into blocks and lots. It had commercial buildings of brick and wood. It had hotels, warehouses, shops, and offices. It had a functioning port that connected it to other cities along the Pacific coast and beyond. It had newspapers, civic institutions, and a resident population that was growing steadily. This was a city that had been built with real investment and real intention. Chicago's situation, at the time of its raising projects in the 1850s and 1860s, was even more developed. By the middle of the 19th century, Chicago was one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States. Its population had expanded dramatically in a short period of time. Its position at the southern end of Lake Michigan made it a critical hub for trade between the eastern states and the expanding American interior. Railroads were converging on the city from multiple directions. Grain, livestock, and lumber passed through Chicago in enormous volumes. The city had banks, hotels, newspapers, manufacturing operations, and a civic infrastructure that was recognized nationally. It was not a frontier settlement. It was an established urban center with significant economic weight. This matters because one of the arguments used to explain why these cities needed to be raised is that their founders made poor location decisions. The cities were built on low ground, on floodplains, on land that was too close to water and too susceptible to the problems that come with that proximity. The raising, under this argument, was the necessary correction for a mistake made at the founding. It was a second attempt to get the infrastructure right after the first attempt had failed. That framing is understandable. It is tidy. It assigns cause and effect in a way that is easy to follow. But it contains an assumption that deserves more scrutiny than it usually receives. The assumption is that the people who founded these cities did not understand the problems with the land they were building on, that they looked at low-lying tidal ground and flood-prone lakefront soil and simply did not recognize what that would mean for drainage, for sewage, for the long-term stability of streets and foundations, that the problems which became severe enough to require the raising of entire city districts were problems that no one anticipated when the original decisions were made. This assumption is embedded in the official narrative. It is not always stated explicitly, but it is the only way the standard explanation fully holds together. Because if the founders did understand the land's limitations, then the question of why they built there anyway becomes significantly more complicated. And here is the difficulty. The people who established American cities in the 19th century were not, as a rule, careless about site selection. Most early settlements chose their locations with considerable deliberateness, based on a practical assessment of the factors that would determine survival and growth. Access to navigable water was important for trade and transport. Proximity to natural resources, timber, farmland, stone, was important for construction and sustenance. Elevated ground was preferred for defense and for avoiding the problems that came with low-lying terrain. When a settlement was placed on low ground near water, it was almost always because the trade advantages of that position outweighed the known difficulties. The founders accepted certain risks because the benefits were judged to be greater. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult. Accepting a risk is different from not seeing it. If Seattle's founders accepted the tidal flooding risk because of the port's importance, that is a defensible decision. But it also means they knew the flooding would be a problem, which means the problem was not a surprise. Which means the question shifts from why did the original city have drainage issues to why was nothing done about those drainage issues for several decades before the fire gave planners the opportunity to act. Cities with known flooding problems do not simply wait for a catastrophic fire to justify fixing them. They patch, they adapt, they implement incremental solutions. The historical record of what was done, or not done, about Seattle's flooding in the years between its founding and the 1889 fire is not prominent in most accounts of this story. Chicago presents a slightly different version of the same puzzle. The city's drainage problems were serious and widely acknowledged long before the raising projects began. The flat, low terrain near Lake Michigan meant that waste had nowhere to go. The water table was too close to the surface for conventional sewage systems to function properly. These were known conditions. Engineers and city officials had discussed solutions for years before the decision to raise the city was finally made and executed. The delay between identifying the problem and implementing the solution spanned a significant portion of Chicago's early history. Why the solution took as long as it did to begin, and why, when it finally came, it took the dramatic form of lifting entire blocks of buildings rather than a more incremental approach, is not fully explained in the standard accounts. These were not small frontier outposts. That point is worth staying with for a moment. A frontier outpost can be rebuilt or relocated with relatively little disruption. The investment is small, the population is mobile, the attachment to any particular location is pragmatic rather than permanent. But Seattle in the 1880s and Chicago in the 1850s were not that kind of place. They were cities with real economic infrastructure, with property values, with business interests, with residents who had invested heavily in their presence there. Raising the entire street level of such a city is not just an engineering decision. It is an economic and political decision of enormous consequence. Property owners, businesses, and residents would all be affected. The coordination required to get agreement on such a project, let alone to execute it, would have been a significant challenge in its own right. The recurring argument that early American cities were simply built in the wrong place is an argument that is rarely examined from the perspective of the people who built them. From that perspective, the location choices were not obviously wrong. They were made by individuals and groups who had practical knowledge of the terrain and a clear understanding of what they were trying to accomplish. They built where they built for reasons that made sense at the time. The idea that an entire generation of urban founders simply failed to notice that the land was unsuitable for the cities they were building is, at minimum, a generous interpretation. It attributes to them a level of short-sightedness that is difficult to reconcile with what they actually achieved. This inconsistency is small. That is how it is usually treated, as a minor awkwardness in the story, easily smoothed over by invoking the general chaos and ambition of 19th century American development. Cities were built fast. Decisions were made under pressure. Mistakes were made and corrected. This is all true. But a small inconsistency that appears in multiple cities, in multiple contexts, and that resists simple explanation, is not quite the same as a random error. It is the kind of thing that accumulates. And accumulated inconsistencies, even small ones, have a way of pointing towards something that has not been fully addressed. There is also the question of what the cities looked like, physically, before the raising. The historical photographs and drawings from Seattle in the 1880s show a city with real architectural presence. The buildings were not temporary structures thrown up in haste. Many of them were substantial constructions with brick facades, large windows, and the kind of detail work that indicates an expectation of permanence. They were built to last. And yet, within a few years of those photographs being taken, the ground floors of many of those buildings were sealed underground, and a new city was constructed above them. Why invest so significantly in buildings that would soon lose their street-level access? The standard explanation offers one answer, that the fire forced a change, and the new construction followed. But the timeline of investment, destruction, and rebuilding still raises questions that are not easily set aside. It lingers. That is perhaps the most honest way to describe the feeling that comes from looking closely at the context of these cities before their raising. The official explanation has answers for the major questions, but underneath those answers, and running alongside the documented history, there are smaller questions that the explanations do not quite reach. Why build there if the land was unsuitable? Why wait so long to fix known problems? Why invest so heavily in structures at a ground level that would soon be rendered obsolete? None of these questions require a dramatic answer, but they do require an answer of some kind. And for the most part, the historical record does not provide one. It simply moves on, as history often does, from what happened to what happened next, leaving the context of the choice behind, unexamined and unresolved. That unresolved context is part of what makes the buried city story more than just an interesting footnote in American urban history. The underground passages exist. The raising happened. The official explanations account for most of it. But the background, the state of the cities before the raising, the decisions that led to them being built where and how they were, the logic of the founders who apparently chose land that would need to be fundamentally corrected within just a few decades, that background has not been fully examined. And until it is, the story of why entire American cities were buried beneath newer streets remains incomplete in ways that are quiet but persistent. At some point in the investigation of the buried cities, the questions stop being entirely about documents and timelines. They become about the physical evidence itself, about what is actually down there, beneath the streets, in the spaces that were sealed off more than a century ago. Because when researchers and historians have gone into those underground passages, when they have walked through the sections that are now accessible to guided tours, and examined the sections that have been studied more closely by those with a professional interest in what survived, what they found does not match entirely with what the official explanation would predict. And that gap between expectation and observation is worth examining carefully. The official explanation, broadly stated, describes the underground spaces as the abandoned ground floors of buildings that were damaged or destroyed in the 1889 fire, then built over as the city was reconstructed at a new, higher street level. Under that description, you would expect the underground to look like what it is supposed to be, the lower level of structures that were either gutted by fire, hastily rebuilt in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, or simply left as they were when the new street was raised above them. You would expect signs of fire damage in places. You would expect rough work, brick laid quickly, structural supports added without much precision, surfaces left unfinished because there was no reason to finish them if they were going to be sealed underground anyway. Urgency leaves marks. Improvisation leaves marks. That is what the physical record of emergency rebuilding typically looks like. But this is where it becomes unclear. The underground spaces in Seattle, in the sections that have been most thoroughly examined, do not consistently look like that. The brick walls, in many areas, are in good condition, not partially collapsed, not heavily scorched, not roughly laid. They are intact, and in some cases they are laid with a degree of care and precision that is not typically associated with emergency post-disaster construction. The floors are solid. The structural framing of original storefronts is still present in some sections, not as crumbling remnants, but as recognizable forms. Window openings, door frames, the basic architectural elements of street-level commercial spaces are still there, in a condition that suggests they were built to last, not built in haste to be immediately forgotten. Researchers who have spent time in these underground passages have noted this quality in their accounts. The word that comes up in various forms is not ruin. It is preservation. The spaces feel less like the aftermath of a catastrophe and more like places that were simply closed. Not collapsed, not burned beyond recognition, not filled with rubble and debris from a destroyed city. Closed, sealed off at a certain point in time, and then left undisturbed. The distinction matters because it speaks to the nature of what happened at the surface level above. If the city was truly rebuilt from the wreckage of a devastating fire, the underground should carry more visible evidence of that wreckage. In some areas it does, but in others it does not. There are also questions about certain structural elements that go beyond the general impression of the spaces and into specific details of construction. Some of the brickwork visible in the Seattle Underground uses techniques and materials that are consistent with solid, long-term construction. The mortar joints are regular. The bond patterns, the way individual bricks are arranged to interlock and distribute load, follow established practices that were applied when builders expected a structure to stand for a long time. These are not the characteristics of work done quickly under pressure to create a temporary foundation for a new city being built above. They are the characteristics of work done by experienced craftspeople who were building something intended to function and endure. This detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. If the underground spaces were created because the old ground floors of fire-damaged buildings were simply left in place when the new street level was built above them, then the quality of construction in those spaces should reflect the original purpose of those buildings, ground floor commercial spaces in a city that was still relatively young and rapidly growing. Some of that construction would be solid, some would be rougher. The variation would reflect the variation in the buildings themselves and in the resources of the different property owners who built them. What would not be expected is a consistent pattern of careful, deliberate brickwork in sections that were supposedly built in the chaotic months following a major fire. Yet that is, in places, what has been observed. It does not fully make sense under the standard explanation. The standard explanation places the construction of most of these underground spaces within a narrow window, the period immediately following the 1889 fire, when the city was rebuilding rapidly and the new street levels were being established. But the quality of construction visible in certain sections of the underground suggests a longer timeline, or a different set of circumstances, than that narrow window would imply. Careful brickwork takes time. Consistent bond patterns require attention and skill. These things are not produced in the weeks and months of emergency reconstruction following a catastrophic fire that destroyed the resources and workforce of an entire city district. Some researchers have proposed that the explanation for this discrepancy is straightforward. Not all of the underground structures, they argue, were built after the fire. Some of them were built before the fire, as the solid original ground floors of Seattle's pre-1889 buildings, and simply survived the fire because they were brick or because the fire did not reach every section of the city with equal intensity. Under this view, the good quality brickwork is exactly what you would expect. It is the work of builders who constructed these commercial spaces in the years before 1889, with the intention that they would be used as ordinary ground floor businesses. The fire came. The new street level was built above, and these pre-fire structures became the underground. Their quality reflects their original purpose, not their eventual fate. This is a reasonable explanation. It is consistent with the official account, and it addresses the quality of construction observation without requiring any departure from the established narrative. But it introduces its own unresolved details. If some of the underground structures predate the fire, then the fire's role in creating the underground is less central than the standard narrative implies. The underground was not simply the product of the 1889 disaster. It was, at least in part, the product of construction decisions made before the fire, decisions about how to build, what materials to use, and what standard of workmanship to apply. And that shifts the question from why is the underground so well preserved to why were these buildings built this way in the first place, and what was expected of them. There is a related observation that has been made by some of those who have studied the underground passages more carefully. Certain sections of the underground show what appears to be intentional finishing work on surfaces that would have been invisible or inaccessible once the new street level was built above. Walls that face into the underground space, Walls that would have been sealed into darkness as soon as the street above was completed show evidence of being plastered or surfaced in ways that go beyond what structural necessity would require. If these surfaces were going to be permanently sealed underground, why were they finished at all? Finishing a wall that will immediately be hidden serves no practical purpose. Unless, at the time the finishing work was done, the expectation was that those surfaces would remain visible and accessible. That observation does not prove anything. It is a detail, but it is the kind of detail that does not fit easily into the picture of a city being rapidly rebuilt above abandoned ruins. It suggests, instead, the possibility that some of these spaces were used for a period after the new street level was established, that the transition from above ground to underground was not immediate, and that for a time, the passages functioned as usable spaces rather than sealed voids. This is actually consistent with some historical accounts, which describe the underground being used for storage and service access in the years immediately following the raising. But the quality of the finishing work in certain sections goes further than temporary utility would seem to require. All of this leaves a question that the official explanation does not fully answer. Were some of these structures built with the expectation that they would last, even underground? Not as an accidental outcome of a disaster and a rebuilding process, but as deliberately constructed spaces that were intended to remain functional beneath the surface of a city that was being established at a new level above them? This is not an accusation. It is not a claim that the official history is fabricated or that something is being concealed. It is a genuine question about the intentions behind what was built, and about whether those intentions have been accurately captured in the historical record. The physical evidence in the underground is ambiguous. That is the honest summary of what researchers have found. Some of it is consistent with the official explanation. Some of it raises questions that the official explanation does not clearly resolve. The good condition brickwork, the intact storefronts, the finished surfaces and spaces that were sealed underground. These things can be explained in more than one way. But the fact that they can be explained in more than one way is itself significant. It means the physical record is not simply confirming what the documents say. It is sitting slightly apart from the documentary record, generating its own set of questions. Some sections of the underground look less like they were abandoned in a hurry after a fire, and more like they were simply left. That word, left, carries a different implication than abandoned or buried or forgotten. Things that are left by someone who made a decision to leave them, and decisions leave traces of intention. The underground spaces of Seattle were sealed by intention. What that intention was exactly, whether it was purely pragmatic, whether it was temporary, whether something else was expected to follow, is not entirely clear from what has been preserved in the official record. The spaces are still there. The intention behind them is less certain, and that uncertainty, quiet as it is, does not resolve itself simply by being observed. There is a detail that tends to be left out of most mainstream historical accounts. When the story of American urban development is told, when the histories of cities, their fires, their floods, their rebuilding projects, the focus almost always falls on individual events. A single fire in a single city, a single decision to raise street levels, a single disaster that forced a community to rebuild from the ground up. These are the events that get documented, studied, and taught. They have clear dates, clear causes, and clear outcomes. They fit neatly into a narrative of disaster, followed by recovery. But once you step back from the individual events and begin looking at the broader pattern across multiple American cities, something else begins to emerge, something that the event-by-event account does not fully explain. Several American cities, when examined together, show evidence of significant ground-level changes, not just in isolated areas, not just in the neighborhoods where a documented fire swept through or a flood left its mark, but across wide urban regions, sometimes in parts of a city where no major disaster is recorded at all. This is where the straightforward explanation begins to lose some of its clarity. If the ground level of a given area changed because of a specific event, you would expect the evidence of that change to be concentrated in the area that the event actually affected. What has been observed in some cases is something different. The changes appear more widespread than the known events would account for. This raises questions that are not easy to dismiss. How does the ground level of a district change significantly if there is no documented disaster to explain the change? The standard answers, fire, flood, deliberate raising, all require an event. They require a reason. But when researchers have looked carefully at certain urban areas, they have found evidence of ground-level alteration in places where the historical record does not supply a clear reason. The alteration happened. The evidence is there. The explanation, however, is not always where it is supposed to be. Older maps complicate this picture further. Maps from earlier periods of American urban history, in some cases from the mid-1800s, show streets and building lots positioned at elevations that do not match what the terrain should look like if the ground had always been at its current level. This is not a minor discrepancy. If the maps are accurate, and cartographers of that period generally worked to produce accurate records of the urban landscape they were documenting, then the elevations they recorded tell a story that does not align with what stands above ground today. The streets shown on those older maps were at a different level. The lots were positioned differently. The relationship between the buildings and the ground beneath them was not the same as what exists now. At first, this might seem like a mapping error. Old maps were not always perfectly precise. Surveyors worked under difficult conditions. Instruments were less accurate than modern equivalents. These are reasonable considerations, but this explanation does not account for the pattern that emerges when multiple maps from multiple cities are examined. The discrepancies are not random. They are not scattered in ways that suggest simple measurement error. They point in several cases in a consistent direction toward ground levels that were once lower than what they are today, in areas where no documented raising event is recorded. Geological surveys have added another layer to this. In a few of these cities, formal geological investigations have identified layers of fill material sitting beneath modern streets. Fill material is not a natural geological deposit. It is placed by human activity. Its presence beneath a street is evidence that something was brought in and laid down at some point, that the ground was deliberately raised, or that the space below was filled for some purpose. This in itself is not unusual. Cities routinely add fill material when constructing roads, raising lots, or managing drainage. But the timeline becomes the difficulty. In some of these cases, the fill layers have been dated to periods that predate the known raising events by decades. In other cases, the timeline is harder to establish clearly, and that ambiguity itself becomes a problem for the standard narrative. If fill material existed beneath the street long before the documented raising project that supposedly created the new street level, then the raising project is not the full explanation. Something else was happening before it. What that something was, why fill was being placed beneath certain streets at certain times without a recorded reason, is not clearly answered by the existing historical documentation. The fill is there. The dates are approximately what they are, but the reason behind them, in some cases, is not in the record. Some researchers have pointed to a different category of evidence. Old photographs taken in American cities during the mid-1800s. Photography became increasingly common during this period, and early photographers documented city streets, building facades, and commercial districts with a level of detail that written records alone could not provide. These photographs have been examined carefully, and in some cases, what they show does not match what the official elevation records would predict. The specific detail that has drawn attention is the positioning of windows and doors in building facades. In architecture, the placement of a building's ground floor openings, the height of its windows from a street, the position of its doorways relative to the pavement, reflects a relationship between the structure and the ground it sits on. When a building is constructed, its openings are placed at heights that make sense for the street level that exists at the time. Ground floor windows are placed so that they can be seen from the street. Doorways are set so that they are accessible. These are not accidental details. They are deliberate design choices that reveal something about the conditions under which the building was built. In the photographs that have been examined, some building facades show windows and door openings positioned in ways that suggest the ground level at the time the photograph was taken was lower than what the official records indicate. Even before any documented raising project had begun, the windows are higher than they should be relative to the apparent street. The doorways have more visible foundation beneath them than would be expected. If the ground was always at the level the records suggest, the proportions visible in those photographs do not fully make sense. But if the ground was once lower, if the street visible in those old photographs was at an elevation below what the official account places it, then the proportions become consistent. This raises a possibility that is not part of the standard historical account. Ground-level changes in American cities may not have happened only in the dramatic, well-documented moments, the fire, the flood, the formally organized raising project. They may have been happening incrementally, gradually, over a longer period than is typically acknowledged. Small adjustments, modest additions of fill, slow accumulations of material that raised the effective street level bit by bit over years or decades, without any single event that clearly marks the change. If this is what happened, it would explain why some areas show evidence of elevation change without a documented cause. The cause was not a single event. It was a process. This kind of incremental change would be easy to miss in the historical record. Individual additions of fill, small raises in local street grades, gradual accumulations of debris and construction material. None of these would necessarily generate formal documentation. They would happen quietly, at the level of routine urban maintenance and construction, without being recorded as significant events. Only in retrospect, when the cumulative effect of those changes becomes visible in the gap between old maps and current elevations, would the pattern become apparent. And by that point, the specific decisions and actions that produced the change would be long past the reach of any documentary investigation. It does not fully make sense to assume that these changes were all accidental or unplanned. Some amount of incremental ground-level change is normal in any city. Streets get repaved. Sidewalks get raised. Drainage infrastructure gets modified. These things happen in the ordinary course of urban maintenance, and they do produce slow changes in effective ground level over time. But the scale of what has been observed in some of these cities, the extent of the elevation differences, the breadth of the areas affected, the consistency of the direction of change, suggests something beyond routine maintenance. It suggests, at least in some places, a more substantial and more deliberate process of alteration. The question of when these changes began does not have a clear answer. The documented raising projects have specific dates: the 1889 fire in Seattle, the formal decisions to raise Chicago's streets in the mid-1800s, the recorded flood response projects in other cities. But the fill layers that predate these events, the map discrepancies that appear before the known projects, the photographic evidence that suggests lower ground levels even before documented raising, these things push the timeline back. They suggest that changes were underway before the events that are usually cited as their cause. And if the changes predated the causes, then the standard explanation has the sequence wrong. Some researchers have proposed explanations for this. The most common is that cities were always subject to incremental, undocumented ground-level changes, and that the dramatic raising projects of the 1800s were simply the most visible and well-recorded phase of a much longer process. Under this view, there is no deep mystery. Cities grow upward as well as outward. Material accumulates. Streets rise over time. The documented events are simply the points where this ongoing process became concentrated and intentional enough to generate a formal record. This is a reasonable position. It is consistent with how cities are known to develop, but it does not account for all of the specific observations that have been made, particularly the fill layers with early dates and the map discrepancies in areas with no recorded raising activity of any kind. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. A process of normal, incremental urban accumulation would not be expected to produce consistent fill layers at specific depths beneath streets across multiple areas of a city. Normal accumulation is varied and uneven. It reflects the different patterns of use, construction, and maintenance in different parts of a city. What the geological surveys have found in some cases is less consistent with random accumulation and more consistent with deliberate placement. Not everywhere, not in every city, but in enough places to make the incremental accumulation explanation feel incomplete when applied to the full set of observations. What emerges from all of this is not a clear answer. It is a set of observations that, taken individually, might each have a satisfying conventional explanation. Old maps might contain errors. Photographs might be misread. Geological layers might be misdated. Any one of these possibilities, applied to any one of these observations, could close the question. but the observations exist together. They appear across multiple cities. They point in the same general direction, and together they suggest that the history of ground-level change in American cities is more complicated, more extended in time, and less fully documented than the standard account implies. The question of when these changes began and why remains genuinely open, not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence that exists does not fully fit the explanations that have been offered for it. There's one more detail worth considering. The cities where these observations have been made most clearly are not random. They are cities that experienced rapid growth during a specific period, the mid to late 1800s, when American urban development was moving faster than the infrastructure meant to support it. Streets were being laid, buildings were going up, drainage systems were being attempted, and the relationship between a city and the ground it occupied was being worked out in real time. In that environment, ground-level changes could happen without formal planning simply because no formal planning system yet existed to record them. Decisions were made locally by individual property owners and city workers, without the kind of documentation that later urban management systems would produce. If something was buried in that period, the record of its burial might simply not exist. Not because it was concealed, but because no one thought to write it down. That absence of documentation is itself significant. It means the historical silence around certain ground-level changes is not evidence that nothing happened. It is evidence only that whatever happened was not formally recorded. Those are two different things, and the difference matters when trying to understand whether the pattern of changes that has been observed reflects a known, well-documented process or something that operated outside of, or before, the reach of the official record. The observations point toward the second possibility more strongly than the first. But pointing toward a possibility is not the same as confirming it. That distinction is worth holding on to as the investigation continues. What makes this particular thread of inquiry difficult to close is that it does not rest on a single claim or a single category of evidence. It rests on the convergence of several different types of observation: cartographic, geological, photographic, and structural, all pointing toward the same general conclusion. Ground-level changes in American cities were more widespread, more varied in their causes, and more extended in time than the mainstream historical account typically acknowledges. The well-documented events, the fires, the floods, the formal raising projects, may be the visible peaks of a much longer and less visible process, a process that was already underway before those events occurred, a process that continued, in some places, without ever being formally recorded, and a process whose full extent and meaning is still not entirely clear from the evidence that has so far been examined. When a pattern appears once, it can be explained as an exception. When it appears twice, it might be coincidence. But when the same pattern appears across multiple cities, in different parts of a country, under different conditions, and within a relatively short span of time, that is when it becomes worth examining more carefully. Not with the assumption that something is wrong, but with the recognition that a repeating pattern usually means something. It usually reflects a shared cause, a shared condition, or a shared set of pressures that push different places toward the same outcome. What that shared cause was, in this particular case, is not entirely clear, and that lack of clarity is part of what makes the pattern worth paying attention to. The pattern in question involves ground-level changes, significant, large-scale alterations to the effective elevation of city streets, changes that buried existing structures, sealed off previously accessible spaces, and created underground environments that now sit beneath the visible surface of the city. This kind of change has been documented in several American cities, and the important detail is not just that it happened in more than one place. It is where those places are, and what they have in common, or more precisely, what they do not have in common. Because the cities where this pattern appears are not a single type of city. They are spread across different regions, different climates, and different histories. They were built by different communities, at different points in time, for different purposes. And yet they all show the same general phenomenon. Cities in the Midwest have documented cases of ground levels being substantially raised. Cities in the Pacific Northwest show evidence of underground spaces sealed beneath new street levels. Cities on the East Coast have their own versions of the same story. Streets raised, lower floors buried, the functional ground level of a neighborhood shifted upward by a significant amount. In each case, a local explanation is available. Fire, flooding, sanitation problems, the need to improve drainage. These explanations are not invented. They are grounded in real conditions that those cities faced. But the fact that so many different cities, facing different specific problems, all arrived at the same type of solution, within roughly the same historical period, is a detail that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The historical window in question is roughly the mid to late 1800s. This is the period when most of the documented ground-level changes in American cities took place. It is also, not coincidentally, a period of rapid and often turbulent urban growth across the country. American cities were expanding at a pace that the infrastructure of the time was not well equipped to manage. Streets were laid without adequate planning. Buildings went up faster than drainage systems could be designed to handle them. Sanitation was a persistent and serious problem in dense urban areas. Flooding was common in cities built near rivers or on low-lying ground. These were real conditions, and they generated real pressure to make changes. Some historians point to exactly this context when explaining the pattern. The rapid, chaotic nature of American urban development in the 1800s made large-scale corrections almost inevitable. Cities were built quickly, often poorly, and with limited foresight about what sustained growth would require. The ground-level changes of the mid to late 1800s, under this view, are simply the physical record of those corrections being made. The fact that many cities undertook them within a similar period reflects the fact that many cities faced similar growing pains at similar times. This is a reasonable explanation. It fits with what is known about American urban history, and it accounts, in broad terms, for why the pattern exists at all. But this is where it becomes unclear. A general explanation for why many cities made ground-level changes during this period does not fully account for the specific details of what those changes produced. It explains the impulse to change. It does not entirely explain the scale, the method, or the outcome, because when the underground spaces that resulted from these changes are examined closely, when researchers and historians have gone into those sealed environments and looked at what is actually preserved there, what they find does not always match what a narrative of chaotic, rushed urban correction would predict. The underground spaces in several of these cities do not look like the remnants of inadequate or improvised construction. They do not consistently show the signs of rushed work, poor planning, or hasty improvisation that you would expect to find if these were simply the failed lower levels of a poorly built city being corrected from above. In some areas, the opposite is true. The structures preserved underground are solid. The brickwork is careful. The spatial organization of the buried streets and storefronts reflects a degree of planning and intention that is not typically associated with urban environments that needed to be replaced because they were not working. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. If a city's ground level was raised because the existing urban environment was inadequate, because the streets flooded, because drainage was impossible, because sanitation had become a crisis, then the spaces sealed beneath the new street level should carry evidence of those problems. They should show the limitations of what was built before. Instead, in multiple documented locations across different cities, the underground spaces show something closer to the opposite. They show functional, well-constructed environments, spaces that appear to have been built with care and used with purpose. The question that follows from this observation is straightforward, even if the answer is not. Why would a functional, well-built urban environment need to be buried? One answer is that functionality and adequacy are not the same thing. A building can be well constructed and still sit at the wrong elevation. A street can be solidly paved and still flood regularly because it was laid at a grade that water cannot drain from. The quality of the construction inside the underground spaces does not necessarily tell us anything about whether those spaces were at the right level. It tells us only that the people who built them carefully. The decision to raise the street above them may have had nothing to do with the quality of what was already there. It may have been purely about elevation, about the relationship between the built environment and the water, or the terrain, or some other condition that the original street level could not resolve. This explanation is reasonable, but it introduces a different question. If the underground structures were well built, if they were solid, functional, and carefully constructed. Then burying them represented a significant loss of useful infrastructure. In cities that were growing rapidly and facing resource constraints, the decision to seal off working spaces rather than adapt them is not a simple or obvious one. It required a specific set of circumstances in which building above was more practical or more necessary than modifying what was already there. Those circumstances may well have existed, but they are not always clearly documented in the historical record, and the absence of that documentation leaves the decision itself somewhat unexplained. There is also the question of timing. The ground-level changes in different cities did not all happen for the same reason, and they did not all happen at exactly the same moment, but they cluster within a relatively narrow historical window, and within that window, certain features are consistent across locations. The underground spaces were sealed rather than demolished. The transition from above ground to below ground happened at a specific point and was not reversed. The new street level, once established, became permanent. These consistent features across different cities and different stated causes suggest that there may have been something more than local circumstance driving the decisions, some shared understanding or shared pressure that produced the same type of outcome in different places. Some researchers have pointed to this clustering as evidence of a broader pattern of urban decision-making in the 1800s, a period when city planners, engineers, and civic authorities across the country were grappling with the same fundamental challenges and arriving at similar solutions. Under this view, the consistency of the pattern reflects the consistency of the problems. Growing cities with inadequate drainage, poor sanitation, and rapid development all needed the same kind of intervention, and the engineering solutions available at the time all pointed in the same direction. Raise the street, improve the grade, build above what was there before. This interpretation is plausible. It treats the pattern as a natural consequence of shared conditions rather than evidence of anything unusual. But even within this interpretation, certain specific observations remain difficult to fully account for. The quality of the sealed underground spaces is one. The breadth of the changes in some cities, extending into areas where no major disaster is recorded, is another. And there's a third detail that has been noted by researchers who have examined the underground environments most closely. In some of the sealed spaces, the evidence of use does not stop cleanly at the moment of sealing. There are signs of continued activity in some areas after the new street level was established above. Storage, service access, movement through passages that were technically underground but apparently still functioned as usable spaces for a period after the raising. The underground did not simply stop being used the moment the new street was built above it. The transition was more gradual, more complicated, and less complete than the standard account typically suggests. This raises a question about what exactly the raising of a street level meant in practice. In the period when it happened, the formal decision, the civic order, the engineering plan, the work of actually laying new street surfaces at a higher elevation, that part is documented. But the lived experience of what followed, in the weeks and months and years after the new level was established, is less clearly recorded. For building owners whose ground floors had just become basements, the change was not abstract. It was immediate and practical. They had spaces that were now underground. Those spaces still existed. They were still accessible, in some cases, from the levels above or through passages at the old street level. The question of what to do with them, whether to seal them, continue using them, or repurpose them, was not a question that had a single predetermined answer. The variety of responses to that question is visible in the underground environments that have been preserved. Some spaces appear to have been sealed immediately and left undisturbed. Others show evidence of continued use, modification, and adaptation over a period of years. This variation reflects the variation in local circumstances, in what individual property owners decided to do, and how quickly the new street level became fully established, and how accessible the underground spaces remained as the city above them continued to develop. It is a complicated picture, and that complexity is itself a form of evidence. Evidence that the creation of these underground environments was not a single uniform event, but a process that played out differently in different places and over different timescales. What remains consistent across all of these variations is the basic fact of the pattern itself. Multiple American cities, across different regions and different histories, show significant ground-level changes concentrated in the mid to late 1800s. In each case, a local explanation is available. In each case, that explanation is at least partially adequate. But in each case, there are also specific details in the quality of the underground structures, in the breadth of the changes, in the evidence of continued use after sealing, that the local explanation does not fully resolve. The pattern is real. The explanations are incomplete. And the gap between the two is where the most interesting questions remain. That gap does not point to any single conclusion. It does not prove that the standard historical account is wrong, or that something is being deliberately withheld. What it does suggest is that the standard account is not the complete account. The history of ground-level change in American cities is more layered, more varied, and more unresolved than a city-by-city, disaster-by-disaster explanation allows for. When you step back from the individual events and look at the full pattern, the geography of it, the timing of it, the physical evidence that has survived within the sealed spaces, what you see is something that the event-driven narrative was not designed to explain. Not because the narrative is dishonest, but because it was built to answer different questions than the ones the pattern raises. The questions the pattern raises are still, in large part, unanswered. There is also something worth noting about the way these underground environments have been treated in the decades since they were sealed. In most cases, they were simply left, not investigated systematically, not formally studied as a category of historical evidence. Access was limited, documentation was incomplete, and the spaces themselves were treated more as curiosities or as practical infrastructure problems than as sites of genuine historical significance. Only relatively recently have researchers and historians begun to look at them more carefully, to ask not just what they are, but what they reveal about the cities built above them. That shift in attention is still incomplete. Much of what is underground has not been examined in detail, and what has been examined has not always been interpreted in ways that account for the full range of what it shows. The investigation, in that sense, is still early, and that is perhaps the most honest summary of where things stand. The pattern is documented. The evidence is real. The questions it raises are specific and grounded in observable details, not in speculation or in claims that go beyond what the physical record actually shows. But the answers to those questions are not yet fully formed. The history of ground-level change in American cities during the 1800s is a subject that has been described many times, in many different contexts, through many different local lenses. What it has not yet been, in any comprehensive and systematic way, is examined as a single coherent pattern with a shared set of questions that apply across all the cases. That kind of examination is what the evidence seems to be asking for. Whether it will eventually produce clearer answers, or only more precisely defined questions, is not something that can be known in advance. What can be said is that the pattern itself, persistent, widespread, and only partially explained, is not going away simply because it is inconvenient for a simpler account of American urban history. At some point in any investigation of buried urban spaces, the question shifts. It stops being purely about history and timelines and documentary evidence. It becomes about something more immediate, about what is actually there, about what physically exists beneath the streets of cities that have been built, rebuilt, and built again over more than a century and a half. Because the underground spaces in these cities are not theoretical. They are real. They are down there right now, beneath the pavement, beneath the foundations of buildings that are still in use today. And the question of what they contain, what has been preserved, what has been lost, and what has simply never been looked at, is not a question that has been fully answered. In Seattle, the underground is more accessible than in most cities where this kind of buried environment exists. Guided tours have been running there for decades. Visitors walk through sections of what were once active commercial streets. They can see original storefronts, the frameworks of shop fronts that once faced a street that is now a ceiling above them. They can see where signs once hung, where sidewalks once ran at what was then street level, where the structural walls of buildings still standing above were once their ground floors. The experience of walking through those spaces is unusual. The city above was built directly on top of the city below. The two layers coexist, separated by a few feet of construction, and visitors to the underground are moving through what is effectively a preserved cross-section of an earlier urban moment. But this is where it becomes unclear. The guided tour sections, the passages that are open, lit, documented, and accessible to the public, are not the whole of what exists underground in Seattle. They are a portion of it, a carefully selected and maintained portion. The full extent of the underground spaces in that city has not been fully mapped. Not all of it has been formally surveyed. Not all of it has been entered and examined by anyone with a professional interest in what might be found there. Some sections are sealed. Some are inaccessible due to structural concerns. And some are simply closed, not because they are dangerous, and not because they have been studied and found to contain nothing of interest, but because no one has gone in. The distinction between sealed for safety and sealed by default is an important one. The first implies a decision based on knowledge. The second implies an absence of knowledge entirely. The question of what exists in those unexamined sections is genuinely open. It is not a rhetorical question. It is a practical one with a real answer that simply has not yet been found. Those spaces exist. They contain something, whether that is structural remnants, preserved materials, objects left behind when the sealing occurred, or simply empty passages that have been undisturbed for over a century. The specific contents of unexamined underground sections in Seattle are unknown, and because they are unknown, any claim about what is or is not there would be speculation. What is not speculation is the fact that those spaces have not been fully investigated. That much is documented. It is part of the official record of what has and has not been done. This matters for a straightforward reason. If the underground spaces of Seattle were simply the abandoned lower floors of fire-damaged buildings, quickly buried under a new street level and left to deteriorate, then what is found in the unexamined sections should be consistent with that story. Deteriorated materials, rubble, the structural remnants of hastily abandoned spaces. But if the examination of the accessible sections has already produced observations that sit uneasily with that straightforward account, the quality of the brickwork, the intact storefronts, the evidence of deliberate construction, then what the unexamined sections might reveal is a genuinely open question, one that cannot be answered without actually going in. The situation in other cities is different, and in some ways more difficult to assess. In many American cities where significant ground-level changes occurred during the mid to late 1800s, the underground spaces are not preserved or accessible in any meaningful way. They have been built over, filled in, or simply absorbed into the foundation infrastructure of the city that was constructed above them. There are no guided tours. There are no formal surveys. There is, in most cases, no active awareness that anything worth examining might exist beneath the current street level at all. The underground there is not sealed and waiting. It has been, for practical purposes, eliminated as a distinct space, merged with the structure of the city above it and no longer separable from it. This creates a different kind of evidentiary problem. In Seattle, the question is what exists in the unexamined sections. In other cities, the question is what existed before it was built over, and what was observed, recorded, or noted by the people who encountered it during construction. And this is where the historical record becomes genuinely thin. Construction projects that cut through buried urban layers in the mid to late 1800s and into the early 1900s did not always generate detailed documentation of what was found. Workers excavating a foundation for a new building might break through into an older underground space. That event might be noted briefly in a contractor's report, or mentioned in a newspaper column, or simply not recorded at all because the workers did not consider it significant enough to document. What was found in those moments, what was seen, what was preserved, what was removed or destroyed, is largely outside the reach of the historical record. What records do exist from that period are inconsistent. City archives from the mid-1800s, the period when most of these ground-level changes were taking place, are not uniform in their completeness or reliability. Some cities maintained careful administrative records. Others did not. Some records have survived intact. Others have been damaged, lost, or destroyed over the intervening century and a half. And in some cases, the records from specific periods that would be most relevant to understanding what happened during the raising and sealing of urban ground levels, are missing in ways that are not easily explained. Not damaged, not deteriorated, simply absent. The files that should be there, in the sequence of a city's administrative history, are not there. That absence of documentation is itself an unexplained detail. This needs to be stated carefully, because the absence of records is not in itself evidence of anything beyond poor archival practices or the ordinary losses that time inflicts on paper documents. Cities in the 1800s were not always careful record keepers. Fires destroyed archives. Floods did the same. Administrative transitions led to records being misfiled or discarded. These are normal historical explanations for gaps in the documentary record, and they apply in many cases. But they do not apply uniformly. And in cases where records from adjacent periods are intact, where the years before and after a specific gap are well documented, the absence of records from that specific period is harder to explain as simple archival loss. Some researchers have noted these gaps in passing. They appear in footnotes, in the acknowledgement sections of academic studies, in the qualifications that historians attach to their conclusions when the supporting documentation is thinner than they would like. What is less common is a systematic examination of where the gaps appear, how they cluster, and whether their distribution is consistent with random archival loss or whether it follows some other pattern. That examination has not, to any significant degree, been done. The gaps are noted individually. They are not studied as a category. And the question of whether they are significant, whether their distribution tells us something beyond the ordinary fragility of historical records, remains unasked in any formal sense. There is also the question of what happened to objects and materials recovered from underground spaces during construction and excavation work. When a building foundation breaks through into an older sealed space, the workers do not always stop to catalog what they find. The pressure of construction schedules, the cost of delays, the practical difficulty of treating an unexpected underground space as an archaeological site. These things work against careful documentation. Materials get removed. Spaces get filled. The work continues. What was found is noted, if at all, in passing references that do not capture the full picture of what was there. In some cases, objects recovered from underground spaces during construction work in American cities during the 1800s and early 1900s found their way into private collections, local historical societies, or simply into disposal. The full record of what was recovered and what it looked like and what it suggested about the spaces it came from has never been compiled in any systematic way. This is not an accusation. It is a description of how excavation and construction typically work when they are not conducted under formal archaeological oversight. The absence of systematic documentation about what was found in these spaces during construction is a normal feature of how cities were built in that period. It is not evidence of deliberate concealment, but it is evidence of a significant gap, a gap between what was physically encountered in those underground spaces over the course of a century of construction activity, and what was formally recorded about those encounters. What fell into that gap is, by definition, no longer fully recoverable. The record that was not made cannot be reconstructed. What remains, then, is a partial picture. In Seattle, a portion of the underground is accessible and has been examined to a limited degree. A larger portion is sealed and unexamined. In other cities, the underground has been largely eliminated as a distinct space, absorbed into the foundation layers of subsequent construction. The records that would document what was found in those spaces during that process are inconsistent and in some cases missing. The objects that were recovered have not been systematically cataloged, and the questions that a systematic investigation might answer about what these spaces contained, about the quality and nature of what was built there, about whether the standard account of their creation and use is fully accurate, remain open, not because the answers are known and being withheld, but because the investigation needed to find them has not, in any comprehensive way, been conducted. That fact is worth sitting with for a moment. The underground spaces of American cities are not a newly discovered phenomenon. They have been known about, in the case of Seattle, for well over a century. The existence of buried street levels has been part of the local history of multiple cities for generations. And yet the systematic, cross-city examination of what those spaces actually contain, what they reveal about the decisions made to create them, and about the urban environments that were sealed within them, is still, in large part, waiting to be done. The spaces are there. The questions about them are real and specific. the tools and methods needed to investigate them exist. What has been missing so far is the sustained and comprehensive attention that the evidence suggests the subject deserves. Consider what it would mean, practically speaking, to conduct that kind of investigation, to go into the unexamined sections of Seattle's underground with proper equipment and documentation, to survey what is there, map what has survived, catalog the materials and structural details, and compare what is found against the official account of how and why those spaces were created. That kind of work would not be expensive relative to many historical research projects. It would not require unusual expertise. It would require time, access, and a decision by the relevant authorities to treat those spaces as something worth examining rather than something to be managed as an infrastructure concern. None of those requirements are impossible. They are simply, so far, not met. The investigation has not happened. The spaces are still there, and the questions they raise are still unanswered for a reason that has less to do with difficulty than with priority. The same is true of the archival gaps. A systematic examination of city records from the mid to late 1800s, specifically looking at where documentation is missing, how those gaps are distributed across time and subject matter, and whether any pattern in their absence corresponds to the periods when ground-level changes were being made, would be a substantial but manageable research project. It would not answer every question. It would not fill the gaps themselves, but it would tell us something important about the nature of those gaps, whether they are the result of ordinary archival loss, distributed randomly across the historical record, or whether they cluster in ways that suggest something more specific was happening, or not happening, at particular moments. That distinction matters, and it is a distinction that has not yet been drawn, because the examination needed to draw it has not been done. What is left, in the absence of that examination, is a collection of observations that each carry their own weight, but have not yet been brought together in a way that gives them collective meaning. The inaccessible underground sections, the missing records, the untracked fate of objects recovered during construction, the gaps in documentation from key periods. Each of these, taken alone, is a detail. Taken together, they describe a subject that has been consistently underexamined relative to what it might reveal. That underexamination is not a conclusion. It is a condition, and it is a condition that the existing evidence, partial, uneven, and incomplete as it is, continues to push against. And that condition, the persistent underexamination of underground spaces whose existence is known, whose significance is at least partly recognized, and whose investigation is practically possible, is itself a kind of finding. It does not tell us what is in the unexamined sections. It does not explain the missing records or account for the objects that were recovered and never cataloged. But it tells us that the study of these spaces has not yet reached the point where the available evidence has been fully considered. The picture that exists is built from fragments. Some fragments from Seattle's accessible underground, some from old maps and surveys, some from geological studies, some from the gaps in archives where other records should be. A picture built from fragments is better than no picture at all, but it is not a complete one, and the parts that are missing are not missing because they do not exist. They are missing because they have not yet been looked for with the attention they deserve. When a set of physical facts does not have a single agreed-upon explanation, interpretations tend to multiply. Different researchers, working from the same basic observations, arrive at different conclusions about what those observations mean. This is a normal feature of historical inquiry, particularly when the subject involves incomplete documentation, physical evidence that can be read in more than one way, and events that happened far enough in the past that first-hand accounts are no longer available. The buried city phenomenon, the existence of sealed underground spaces beneath the street levels of multiple American cities, sits squarely in that category. The physical facts are not seriously disputed. The underground spaces exist. The buried street levels are real. What is disputed, sometimes significantly, is the explanation for how they came to be, and the range of interpretations that have been offered covers more ground than the mainstream historical account typically acknowledges. The most widely accepted explanation is the one that has already been examined in some detail. Fires, flooding, sanitation problems, and the practical demands of rapid urban growth drove city authorities and property owners to raise street levels, build above existing structures, and seal the old ground floors beneath the new city. This explanation is supported by documented engineering decisions, contemporary newspaper accounts, administrative records, and the physical evidence of construction work visible in the underground spaces themselves. It is not an invented story. It is grounded in real historical events that can be traced through real historical sources. For the majority of historians who have studied these cities, this explanation is adequate. It accounts for the physical evidence without requiring any departure from what the documentary record shows. But this is where it becomes unclear. Not all researchers who have examined the buried city phenomenon accept the official account as complete. A minority position, held more strongly outside academic history than within it, argues that the documented events, while real, are not sufficient to explain the full scope of what the physical evidence shows. This position takes different forms depending on who is advancing it. Some argue that the official account is accurate as far as it goes, but that it does not go far enough, that the ground-level changes were larger, more widespread, and more complicated than the fire and sanitation narrative captures. Others go further, arguing that the official account is itself a reframing of events that were more significant and less well understood than the documents suggest. Among the more widely discussed alternative interpretations is what has come to be known, in certain research communities, as the mud flood theory. The name is descriptive, if imprecise. The central claim is that the ground-level changes visible in American cities, and, according to proponents of this view, in cities and settlements across other parts of the world as well, were not primarily the result of deliberate engineering decisions. They were the result of a widespread geological or climatic event that deposited large quantities of sediment, soil, and debris across broad areas in a relatively short period of time. Under this interpretation, entire lower levels of buildings were not sealed deliberately. They were buried by an event or series of events whose nature and cause are not clearly identified in the historical record, because the historical record itself was disrupted by or produced in the aftermath of that event. This is a significant claim. It is worth stating clearly what it does and does not assert. The mud flood interpretation does not argue that the cities themselves are fictional, or that the people who lived in them did not exist, or that the underground spaces were built by some unknown civilization. It argues, more specifically, that the mechanism of burial was different from what the official account describes. Not deliberate raising, not engineered construction above existing structures, but a natural or semi-natural process of sediment deposition that covered existing ground floors and required the inhabitants of those cities to adapt by building above the new, higher ground level that the event had created. The official explanation, under this view, is not entirely wrong. It is a rationalization, a description of the adaptation that followed the event, presented as the event itself. Mainstream historians reject this interpretation. That rejection is direct and consistent. The documented evidence for the raising projects, the engineering reports, the construction records, the newspaper accounts describing the process of lifting buildings and laying new street grades is specific, detailed, and consistent with what the physical evidence in the underground shows. There is no geological or climatic event of the scale the mud flood theory requires that appears in the scientific or historical record for the relevant period. The sediment layers beneath American cities, where they have been studied, are consistent with deliberate fill placement and normal urban accumulation rather than sudden catastrophic deposition. And the internal consistency of the official account, the way the documentary evidence from multiple sources fits together into a coherent narrative, is not something that can be easily dismissed. These are serious objections. They are not the objections of researchers who have not looked at the evidence. They are the objections of researchers who have looked carefully and who find the alternative interpretation unpersuasive when measured against what the physical and documentary record actually shows. The mud flood theory, in its strongest form, requires events for which no independent evidence currently exists. That is a significant problem for any interpretation that wants to be taken seriously as history rather than speculation. And yet the rejection of the alternative interpretation does not, by itself, close every question that the physical evidence raises. This is the important distinction. Rejecting the mud flood theory as an adequate explanation does not mean that the official account explains everything completely. The two things are separate. It is possible to find the alternative interpretation unpersuasive and still acknowledge that the standard narrative has gaps, places where the physical evidence does not align neatly with the documentary record, where the quality of what is preserved underground is difficult to account for under a narrative of hasty post-disaster construction, where the scale of the changes exceeds what the stated causes would seem to require. Some researchers occupy exactly this middle position. They do not accept the mud flood interpretation. They accept that fires, flooding, and engineering decisions were the real causes of the ground-level changes in American cities. But they argue that those causes operated in a context that was more complicated than the standard account implies, that the ground, in some places, was already partially altered before the documented events occurred, that the raising projects built on conditions that were not entirely of their own making, that the timeline of changes is longer and more layered than the event-by-event account captures. This middle position is less dramatic than the alternative interpretations and less tidy than the official account, but it may be the most accurate reflection of what the evidence actually shows. What is agreed upon, across all of these positions, is that the physical evidence is real. The underground spaces exist. The buried streets are there. The storefronts and sidewalks and structural walls, preserved beneath the current ground level of certain American cities, are genuine historical artifacts. No serious researcher disputes the existence of the physical record. The disagreement is about what that record means, about what process produced it, what intention lay behind it, and whether the explanation that has been most widely accepted is fully adequate to account for it. That disagreement is worth taking seriously precisely because it exists among people who have looked at the evidence. It is not a disagreement between those who have examined the underground spaces and those who have not. Both the mainstream historians and the researchers advancing alternative interpretations have engaged with the physical record. They are not arguing from ignorance. They are arguing from different assessments of what the same evidence requires. And that kind of disagreement, grounded in genuine engagement with real evidence, is more significant than a disagreement that stems from one side simply not having looked carefully. Between the official explanation and the alternative theories, there is a gap. It is important to define that gap precisely, because it is easy to mischaracterize what it is. It is not a gap in evidence, in the sense that the evidence is absent. There is evidence. For the official account, there is substantial evidence. For the alternative interpretations, there is less, and in some cases the required evidence is entirely absent. The gap is not primarily evidentiary. It is a gap of certainty, a space between what the available evidence proves beyond reasonable doubt and what it leaves open to interpretation. And that space is wider than the standard historical account typically acknowledges. The official account, presented in its most confident form, gives the impression that the questions about these underground spaces have been answered, that the fires and the flooding and the sanitation problems explain what happened, and that the physical evidence is simply the confirmation of what the documents already describe. But the physical evidence, when examined carefully, does not only confirm, it also questions. It raises observations that the documentary record does not fully resolve. And those unresolved observations are what keeps the gap open, what prevents the official account from being the complete and final explanation that its most confident presentation suggests it is. This does not mean the alternative interpretations are correct. It does not mean the mud flood theory should be treated as an equally valid historical explanation alongside the documented engineering decisions and fire records. The evidence for the official account is substantially stronger than the evidence for any of the alternatives. That asymmetry matters. But acknowledging that asymmetry is not the same as saying every question has been answered. The stronger explanation is not necessarily the complete explanation. And the incompleteness of the explanation, the existence of a gap between what the evidence confirms and what it leaves uncertain, is a real feature of the current state of knowledge about these underground spaces. That gap has not been fully closed. This is not a dramatic claim. It is simply an accurate description of where the inquiry stands. The underground spaces of American cities remain, in significant ways, under-examined. The questions about them remain, in specific and demonstrable ways, incompletely answered. The range of interpretations offered to account for them spans from the well-documented to the highly speculative, and the work needed to move more of that range toward certainty. The systematic investigation of unexamined underground sections, the detailed study of archival gaps, the cross-city analysis of physical evidence, remains largely undone. What exists for now is a subject that the evidence has opened more fully than the explanations have yet managed to close. It is also worth considering what it would take to close that gap more meaningfully. Not to resolve every question. Some questions about events from the mid-1800s may simply be beyond the reach of any investigation because the evidence that would answer them no longer exists in any recoverable form. But to move the level of certainty closer to what the subject deserves, the first requirement would be a more systematic examination of the physical record itself. The accessible underground spaces that currently exist in Seattle and in whatever comparable environments might exist in other cities have not been studied with the depth and rigor that an archaeological site of comparable significance would receive. The guided tours are not a substitute for formal documentation. The informal observations of researchers who have spent time in those passages are not a substitute for systematic survey work. What the underground spaces of these cities actually contain, in their full extent, has not been established with the precision that would be needed to answer the questions the evidence raises. The second requirement would be a more careful examination of the documentary record, specifically the gaps in it. Historians working on individual cities have noted, in passing, that certain records are missing from certain periods. What has not been done is a comparative study of where those gaps appear across multiple cities, whether their distribution follows any pattern, and whether that pattern corresponds in any meaningful way to the periods when ground-level changes were being made. This kind of study would not be straightforward. It would require access to archives in multiple cities, the ability to identify absence as well as presence in documentary collections, and a framework for distinguishing normal archival loss from something more specific. None of that is simple, but it is the kind of work that the subject, taken seriously as a historical problem, would seem to require. The third requirement is perhaps the most basic. It is simply the decision to treat these questions as worth pursuing, not as settled history that has already been adequately explained, not as fringe speculation that does not merit serious attention, but as genuine open questions about a real set of physical facts, questions that have specific, answerable dimensions, and that have not yet been answered with the completeness that the evidence suggests is possible. That decision has not, in any broad institutional sense, been made. The underground spaces remain underexamined. The archival gaps remain unstudied as a category. The cross-city comparative analysis that would give the pattern its clearest shape remains undone. And the gap between what is known and what could be known, with sustained and serious attention, remains wider than it should be for a subject whose physical evidence is this substantial and this accessible. What sits in that gap for now is uncertainty. Not the dramatic uncertainty of a complete mystery, where nothing is known and everything is possible, but the quieter and more precise uncertainty of a subject where much is known, more is knowable, and the distance between the two has not yet been fully traveled. The buried streets are real. The questions about them are real. The answers, the full answers, the ones that would close the gap between the official explanation and the observations that do not fit neatly within it, are still, in significant part, waiting. And that waiting is not passive. Every year that passes without a systematic investigation of the unexamined underground sections is a year in which those sections may deteriorate further. Every construction project that cuts through a buried layer without formal documentation is a moment of unrecoverable loss. The evidence is not permanent. It exists now, in the condition it is in now, and what can be learned from it is a function of how soon and how carefully it is examined. The gap that exists between the official explanation and the full picture of what the evidence shows is not a static thing. It has the potential to widen as evidence is lost, or to narrow as investigation proceeds. Which direction it moves depends on decisions that have not yet been made. At the end of any careful investigation, there comes a moment where the accumulated evidence has to be assessed honestly, not dramatized, not simplified into a conclusion that tidies away the parts that do not fit, just assessed as clearly and directly as the evidence allows. That moment arrives now, at the end of this particular inquiry into America's buried cities. And the honest assessment is this: the buried cities are real. They are not a theory. They are not a legend. They are not the product of speculation or the invention of researchers looking for a mystery where none exists. They are a documented, physical reality that sits beneath the street levels of multiple American cities, waiting, in many cases, still waiting, for the kind of attention that their existence deserves. This point is worth stating plainly, because it is sometimes lost in the debate between official explanations and alternative interpretations. Both sides of that debate are, in a sense, arguing about the same thing. They are arguing about an agreed-upon physical reality. The underground spaces exist. The buried streets are there. You can walk through portions of them. You can stand in what was once a ground-floor storefront and look up at the underside of the street that was built above it. You can see original brickwork, original structural framing, the remnants of sidewalks that once carried foot traffic at a level that is now several feet below the surface. This is not something that requires special access to classified information or hidden archives. Parts of it are open to the public. Photographs of the underground streets exist in historical collections. The physical reality of these spaces is about as well established as any feature of American urban history. What is not well established is the full story of how and why they came to be buried. The official explanations, fire, flooding, sanitation, the practical demands of raising street grades in rapidly growing cities, address the question at a general level. They provide a framework that accounts for the basic sequence of events. A disaster occurred, or a decision was made, or a combination of both, and the result was that new street levels were established above the existing ones. That framework is supported by real documentary evidence. It is not invented, but it is, in important ways, incomplete, and the incompleteness is not a minor detail. It concerns some of the most specific and most interesting features of what the underground spaces actually show. The speed of reconstruction in certain cities is one of those features. After major fires, the pace at which some American cities rebuilt and established new street levels was remarkable. In some cases, so fast that it raises questions about how much planning could realistically have been done in the available time. Rapid reconstruction under pressure tends to produce certain visible characteristics. It tends to be uneven, improvised, and focused on getting functional infrastructure in place rather than building to a high standard. But what has been observed in the underground spaces of several cities is not entirely consistent with that picture. Some of what is preserved underground reflects a level of care and precision that does not align well with hasty post-disaster building. That observation does not disprove the official account, but it does not fit neatly within it either. The quality of what was left underground is a related detail. The spaces that were sealed beneath new street levels were not, in many cases, the remnants of destroyed or inadequate structures. They were, in some sections, intact and well-constructed environments. Solid brickwork, recognizable commercial spaces, structural elements in a condition that suggests they were built with the intention of lasting. If these spaces were sealed because they were damaged or because they sat at the wrong elevation, the quality of their construction is not necessarily surprising. Buildings can be solid and still be in the wrong place, but the quality does complicate the narrative of a city discarding its damaged lower floors and starting fresh above them. What was sealed was not, in every case, something that needed to be replaced. And that raises the question of what, specifically, required it to be left behind. The pattern across multiple cities adds another layer of complexity. If the buried city phenomenon were unique to one location, if Seattle alone showed evidence of sealed underground streets, it might be explained entirely by the specific circumstances of that city. The 1889 fire, the particular topography, the specific decisions made by the city's engineers and property owners, all of those local factors would be sufficient to account for a local phenomenon. But the pattern is not local. It appears in multiple cities, across different regions, in places with different histories and different specific causes. The repetition of the pattern across that range of contexts suggests that the local explanations, while real, may not capture everything that was driving the changes. Something broader may have been at work, some shared condition or shared pressure that pushed different cities toward the same type of outcome within the same general historical period. What that something was has not been clearly identified. The gaps in the archival record are perhaps the most quietly significant detail. Records from key periods in the histories of several American cities are missing, not damaged, not deteriorated beyond usefulness, simply absent. Files that should exist, given the administrative practices of the time and the completeness of records from adjacent periods, are not there. This could be the result of ordinary archival loss. Cities in the 1800s did not always maintain their records carefully, and the passage of time is hard on paper documents. That explanation covers many of the gaps, but it does not cover all of them equally well. In cases where the surrounding records are intact and the gap is specific to a particular period or a particular subject, the ordinary loss explanation becomes less convincing. The absence in those cases is more pointed, and a pointed absence in a historical record is worth noting, even if it cannot be fully explained. None of these things, the speed of reconstruction, the quality of the underground spaces, the breadth of the pattern, the archival gaps, prove that the official story is wrong. That point needs to be made clearly. Each of these observations can be addressed, at least partially, within the framework of the standard historical account. The speed of reconstruction can be attributed to the extraordinary social and economic pressure that disasters create. The quality of the underground spaces can be explained by the fact that some of them predate the events that sealed them. The pattern across cities can be accounted for by the shared conditions of rapid American urban development in the 1800s. The archival gaps can be attributed to the normal fragility of historical records over long periods of time. These explanations are available. They are reasonable. They are not fabricated. The buried cities of America have been known about for a long time. In Seattle, the underground tours have been running for decades. The existence of the buried streets has been mentioned in histories, documented in photographs, and visited by thousands of people who have walked through the accessible sections. The subject is not obscure. It is part of the public record of American urban history, and yet the systematic, cross-disciplinary investigation that its significance would seem to warrant has not happened. The accessible spaces have not been fully surveyed. The inaccessible spaces have not been entered. The archives have not been studied with the comparative rigor the gaps require. The physical and documentary evidence has not been brought together in a way that gives it its fullest possible meaning. The buried cities are known. They are simply not, in any comprehensive sense, understood. That gap between known and understood is not a permanent condition. It reflects the state of the investigation as it currently stands, not the inherent limits of what investigation could eventually reveal. The questions about America's buried cities are specific and grounded. They arise from real physical observations and real documentary gaps. They have the shape of questions that could, with sufficient attention, be moved closer to answers. How close is uncertain. Whether the answers that investigation produces will confirm the official account, complicated, or reveal something that neither the official account nor the alternative interpretations have yet identified, that is genuinely unknown. What is known is that the questions remain open, and open questions, in the end, are an invitation, not to speculation, not to the replacement of evidence with imagination, but to the kind of careful, patient, evidence-based inquiry that the buried cities, quietly waiting beneath the streets of American cities that have long since moved on above them, have been asking for all along. That invitation has been extended by the evidence itself, not by any researcher's desire for mystery. The underground spaces do not need to be made more significant than they are. Their significance is already established by the simple fact of what they are: preserved sections of earlier urban environments, sealed beneath cities that continued to grow above them, carrying physical evidence of decisions and events that the documentary record has not fully explained. That is enough. It does not require embellishment. It requires attention. And attention, in this case, means going back to the physical record with fresh eyes and specific questions, going back to the archives with a systematic approach to what is missing as well as what is present, and being willing to sit with the answers, whatever they turn out to be, without forcing them into a shape that is tidier than the evidence actually supports.